Hi, I'm Mark Moskowitz, and I'm honored to be part of the Cleveland Cello Society's Beethoven Cello Fest. As a cellist and co-author of Beethoven's Cello, Five Revolutionary Sonatas and Their World, a book that examines the works you are going to hear over the next two concerts, I have been asked to share a few words about the revolutionary nature of this music. I think it's a subject best approached by a consideration of the cello sonata as it existed at the time Beethoven was composing his works for the instrument. So we'll compare a few pages of Beethoven's music with that of his cello contemporaries, cellists he knew and with whom he even performed. Beethoven's first foray into the world of the cello sonata, the works that would become his Opus 5, were initiated at the Berlin court of Frederick Wilhelm II, himself a cellist and a man who kept a royal group of cellists in his capella. At the time Beethoven came to town, in May of 1796, this entourage included both Duport brothers, and it seems most probably that Beethoven premiered his two early sonatas with the younger, Jean-Louis. Beethoven's appearance at court was documented years later by his student, Ferdinand Ries, who wrote, "In Berlin, he played at the court of Frederick Wilhelm II several times, where he also composed and played the two sonatas for cello and piano, Opus 5, for Duport, the king's first cellist, and himself." Before considering the effect Beethoven's music must have had on the court, let's look at the first page of Duport's sixth sonata, probably composed around the same time as Beethoven's Opus 5. Here we can see how a typical cello sonata looked at the time. A principal line emphasizing technique and various bowing patterns, some embellishing trills, yet nothing remarkable in terms of motivic development. In other words, just another sonata, and this is the sixth of the set. There are no dynamics nor a fully realized keyboard part. Rather, the top line is accompanied by a very subservient, Baroque-inspired bass line. In other words, nothing to get in the way of the principal part. Given the circumstances, Duport probably intended for the lower part to be played by another cellist, or a student, or even the king, although maybe after having practiced and been given a few lessons from one of the Duports, Frederick Wilhelm might have tried his hand at the upper part. Whether or not Beethoven was familiar with music of this sort, his concept from the very beginning was of something else entirely. His is not the work of a cellist, nor even someone who has been experimenting with the genre, whose skills have only now arrived at this stage, but a composer coming to the cello-piano duo for the very first time. In fact, we don't even know if his manuscripts to the Opus 5 were complete or still in a state of development when he arrived in Berlin. He had no models upon which to base such a conception, save perhaps the violin sonatas of Mozart. For all intents and purposes, Beethoven was working in a vacuum. Nothing about this music resembles anything his contemporaries were doing. We see intricate rhythms and motives, a plethora of dynamics, and even silence. Duport's sonata, while tasteful, has no intrinsic musical value. Beethoven's, by contrast, is significant, with great attention to the working out of small motives and an overall dramatic sonata-form arc that unfolds over the course of some 400 measures, without the repeat. Having played it through with Duport, we might imagine the king looking in astonishment at the pianist-composer in front of him and wondering if he truly came from Vienna by way of Dresden like he said, or somehow flew down from another planet. So radically different was his concept from anything that would have been played at court or anywhere else for that matter. And lest you think that Duport's writing not representative of what other cellist composers were producing, and remember that few, if any, non-cellists, or non-string players at least, were writing for the instrument at the time. Here's a page from a sonata by Anton Kraft, a cellist Beethoven knew well in Vienna, and who, along with his son Nicholas, was involved in performing some of Beethoven's chamber music for the first time. Kraft's sonata is even more technically challenging than Duport's, but remains the product of a cellist intent on exploiting his instrument's qualities, whether technical or lyrical. And again, it's cast as a solo line with a subservient cello accompaniment, as opposed to Beethoven's desire to create a sense of real exchange of musical dialogue between the cellist and the pianist. Kraft can be charming if brought off with panache, and it certainly suggests he was an impressive cellist. Yet it remains musically unremarkable and ultimately forgettable, which, in fact, it has been. Jumping ahead to the Opus 69, we see the increasingly deaf composer having learned a great deal from his initial experimentation with the genre a little over a decade earlier. There he sought an unprecedented equality among both players, but here he achieves true parity, a fact he announces with the cello's unaccompanied opening, a striking gambit, and which is followed with each instrument being granted a cadenza. In effect, Beethoven is proclaiming equal ownership. Given the popularity of the sonata, we don't need to chart every revolutionary aspect of the music, but we might simply point out the highly organic working out of his material, and of course, the attacca that takes the all-too-brief Adagio cantabile directly into the finale, a technique that also found its way into other works of this heroic middle period, such as the Fifth Symphony and the Triple Concerto. This is a work born of a composer at the height of his powers. That he has learned to say a great deal more with less is brought home by the consideration of length. The first movement clocks in at about 100 measures shorter than the first movements of his earlier cello sonatas, reminding me a little of the Fifth Symphony, whose dramatic breadth gives the impression of a work longer than it actually is. In the wake of the Congress of Vienna, for which Beethoven admittedly contributed some rather bombastic music, the composer entered into a period of relative compositional stasis, as if unsure where to go musically. For a man of Beethoven's musical temperament, continuing to produce the same style of work as he had written previously was simply not an option. Among the earliest works to jumpstart this late period were the last two cello sonatas, works that are blueprints of a sort, mapping out where he was ultimately headed musically. And sure enough, these late sonatas are as radically different as possible from what came before. Music that is even more shed of excess, with musical ideas whittled down to the barest minimum. Textures are Spartan, the range of voicing sometimes extreme, and in many cases not a measure goes by in either part without some sort of dynamic or expressive marking. In other words, every note is charged with meaning. And of course, by the time we get to that prickly fugue of the D major sonata, the last thing he would write for this combination, we see the composer thinking entirely in terms of four equal voices, a la Bach. In other words, he has achieved complete equality of forces, a path whose origins had been so much a part of his thinking in the Opus 5 from years earlier. To see just how far Beethoven had pulled ahead of his contemporaries, let's look at a page of a sonata from Bernard Romberg, undoubtedly one of the day's foremost virtuosi, and who had actually played the Viennese premiere of Beethoven's Opus 5 back in 1797. Here is a page from one of Romberg's sonatas, a work that probably dates from around a decade after Beethoven's 102 sonatas. Although it's not apparent here, Romberg is still writing for a principal cello line and a subservient bass line. The first cellist's melody is attractive, but extremely square, and reveals little by way of rhythmic interest or true musical dialogue between the players. This is not to belittle Romberg's compositional abilities. As is evident in his charming, if sometimes sentimental, cello pieces, he could spin out attractive tunes, and he was a respected composer in his day, with operas, orchestral works, and other chamber music to his credit. But he was no Beethoven. In fact, Romberg was mystified by much of Beethoven's later work. We need not pursue this course further, but hopefully these brief comparisons with other cello sonatas of the day help to underscore just how radical and revolutionary Beethoven's approach was to the genre. The three variation sets are something else entirely. They were probably composed with amateur music making in mind, as publishers were intent on satisfying a growing middle class, as well as an aristocracy intent on music making at home. Many composers transcribed popular tunes, particularly operatic, for combinations to be played in the privacy of one's home, and Beethoven's variations fall squarely into this category. At one point, Beethoven himself thought Handel the greatest composer, and his Judas Maccabeus variations were certainly inspired by the singing of Handel's music he encountered while in Berlin. Along with the first set of variations from Mozart's Magic Flute, these sets were composed in 1796, the same year and perhaps even around the same time as the Opus 5 sonatas, but in no way can they compare in terms of their revolutionary aspect. Rather, Beethoven is feeding the public music with which they were already familiar. We might recall the closing scene of Don Giovanni, where Mozart pokes fun at his own music's popularity. So Beethoven and his publishers knew only too well that such music would find welcome buyers. The second Mozart set, Variations on Bei Männern welche Liebe fühlen, is also from the Magic Flute, though from a few years later. Like the earlier sets, however, it again shows Beethoven's interest in a developing sense of variation, a technique at the core of much of what Beethoven wrote, even when not specifically writing variations. Here, Mozart's music becomes a real springboard for Beethoven's own invention, and it continues to be thrilling to see what Beethoven brings to what many already would have considered perfect music. If these sets of variations don't dig into the true duo nature as do the sonatas, they are nevertheless substantial products of a brilliant and restless musical mind. And the fact that Beethoven's variations remain an integral part of the cellist's repertoire over 2 centuries after their conception says all we need to know about their significance. Well, we're all anxious to hear some Beethoven, so I'll close by wishing everyone a healthy and safe 2021. Thank you for listening, and now on with the Cleveland Cello Society's Beethoven Cello Fest.